Hi everyone, thanks for joining us today for a special 1 hour 30 on Thursday webinar, SharePoint 2016 MVP panel discussion and demo. Just a little intro about Protiviti before we get started. Protiviti is a global consulting firm that helps companies solve problems in finance, technology, operations, governance, risk, and internal audit. Our enterprise content management solutions is within the IT consulting group of Protiviti. We are in over 20 countries and 70 offices with over 3,000 professionals worldwide. Our 30 on Thursday webinar series has been going for about 5 years now. Our 30-minute webinar series talks about all things SharePoint and enterprise content management. We have 2 great webinars coming up on March 31st and April 28th. If you're interested in registering for either of these webinars or seeing our full schedule, you can go to our website, ecm.protiviti.com/webinars. Our Protiviti On Demand group provides on-demand SharePoint support from customization and enhancements, system health checks to Nintex workflows. We are offering free 1-hour introductory consultations. If you're interested in seeing what our group can do to help, you can schedule your free 1 hour today by emailing us at ecm@protiviti.com. We are doing live tweeting today during the presentation. You can tweet us your questions and feedback during the webinar at ProtivitiECM and use the hashtag 30TSP2016. Again, today's webinar is a special 1-hour session. We're going to do a short presentation, then do a demo, and then continue to a panel discussion. Today's session is being recorded and will be on our YouTube channel, along with an archive of all of our past sessions. For questions today during the presentation, please insert them in the question window of the GoToMeeting toolbar, or again, tweet us your questions at hashtag 30TSP2016, and we will get to the questions during the panel discussion. Today's presenters are 2 great SharePoint MVPs, Doug Hemminger and Antonio Maio here at Protiviti, and we are going to get started. So I'm going to pass the presenter rights over to Doug. We can take it from there.
Thanks, Julia. We're going to go ahead and get started on the presentation, and we have a few slides that Antonio is going to talk about, and I promise you that it will be brief, and then we're going to jump into some demo stuff. So go ahead, Antonio.
All right, thanks very much, Doug. I'll get you to switch. There we go. Thank you. So just a little bit more on Protiviti. Doug Hemminger, myself, Antonio Maio, and Liam Cleary, who is supposed to be with us but couldn't today. We're all part of the Enterprise Content Management Solutions practice at Protiviti, or the ECM Solutions practice. And we offer a wide range of services, starting with full consulting engagements. And this is usually where we work with our clients to either build intranets, extranets, public-facing websites, and so on, ensuring that our clients are getting the full business value and efficiencies that they can gain out of SharePoint. We also have a very robust support team. As Julie mentioned at the beginning of this, we have a Protiviti on-demand services team. That's what this group is. And they work with our clients on a support basis, providing 24/7 support on anything related to SharePoint. And this is often an interesting service for our clients where when we finish a project or a consulting engagement, we're rolling off the engagement, we want to ensure that our clients continue to be supported appropriately in whatever we've built for them or in whatever needs they might have in SharePoint going forward. We also offer SharePoint training, either on-site, virtual. It can be, you can join our public training, or it can be customized for your needs. And then finally, we offer custom development or add-on work for SharePoint. So if there's custom components that need to be developed, workflows, forms, we're often engaged in content migrations for SharePoint as well. All right, so today we're here to talk about what's new in SharePoint 2016, and as Doug mentioned, we're going to keep these slides really brief and get right into demonstrations. I like to usually start these discussions talking a little bit about where SharePoint 2016 came from, Over the last few years, there's been some doubt about the future of the on-premise product for SharePoint from Microsoft and how much it'll be supported in the future. Well, with the release of SharePoint 2016, we're happy to see that it has a very bright future, and Microsoft is making some significant investments in it. And we're going to talk about some of those significant investments and show you some of those here today. I do also find it interesting to note that SharePoint 2016 Server actually came from Office 365. So the way this release began was Microsoft took a snapshot of SharePoint Online at a particular point in time, and they turned that into this new on-premise release. And the way they approached that development effort was that they first identified investments that they had made in Office 365 and determined which ones they could backport to the on-premise release. Now, some of the features that were built into Office 365 had specifically been built for a cloud deployment. Bringing them to the on-prem product required some work to be done for them to fit into an on-premise installed product. And then for those features that they couldn't backport, Microsoft looked at implementing them as new hybrid experiences. And we'll talk about some of those as well today. And then finally, Microsoft looked at some of the new investments that they could make in SharePoint 2016 that would differentiate it from the online product. It's also, I find, really interesting to note that Microsoft's investments in SharePoint 2016 were based on the data that they gathered from their own experiences in running SharePoint for their customers as part of Office 365. So when Microsoft first brought SharePoint to the cloud, it used SharePoint 2013 as a starting point. Microsoft then had to manage this beast, which we all call SharePoint, in the same way that IT professionals like us manage it in our own environments. And many of the improvements that we're getting in 2016 are a direct result of that experience, of Microsoft's experience working to manage SharePoint at scale for its own customers. And from that experience, Microsoft, of course, now understands better what it takes to run this product in a large environment. For example, they realize that patching and updating SharePoint is not easy. It is hard to do. So they've made some major improvements there. There's a lot of examples of this throughout the product, and ultimately the improvements that we're seeing in 2016 are a direct result of this experience and the data that they gathered running SharePoint for their customers. This is data that they like to call telemetry. If you ever hear Microsoft talk about telemetry, that's the data that they gather in running the Office 365 services for their clients. And ultimately, SharePoint 2016 is becoming a much better product both for Microsoft to run and for us to run in our own environments. Okay. And if we look at some of the areas that Microsoft focused on for SharePoint 2016, there's three major areas. The first being improved user experiences. So we see Microsoft innovating pretty rapidly in Office 365. Right, their cloud-first approach has them first bringing new solutions and capabilities to the cloud versions of the products, and we do expect that to continue. But we're seeing many of those experiences in Office 365 now making their way to the on-prem product, some of which we'll show you today. Some of those work out of the box in the on-prem environment by themselves, and some of them do require a connection to the Office 365, to an Office 365 tenant. An example of that is Microsoft in the past has said that Delve, one of the services available in Office 365, will be available to on-prem customers. Now, this suggests, of course, that the app will be running in the context of the SharePoint Server product. However, Delve, of course, we know is powered by the Office Graph, and the compute power that's needed for that only really makes sense as a cloud-only service. So the Delve experience is an example of one of these hybrid experiences, which you could have running on-prem, but consuming a cloud service. So the Office Graph will be fed by signals, for example, from your on-prem contact and activities. The second area of investment is the cloud-inspired architecture. And this is, of course, improvements that we're seeing in performance and reliability, improvements that we're seeing in deploying SharePoint servers, in ensuring that they stay compliant with Microsoft's guidance on how these servers should be configured based on their role, and the improvements in patching and monitoring and so on. And then the third area of investment that we've seen is compliance and reporting. So we do see Microsoft hearing their customers demanding better data loss prevention and tools to ensure that their end users stay compliant with the content that they upload and work with within SharePoint. Okay, and then the last slide that we'll talk to before we get into the demo is around the system requirements for SharePoint 2016. And this is specifically for the release candidate. These changed a little bit from Beta 2. We've got 4 different scenarios in running SharePoint here. Several of these are development and eval experiences. The final one on the table here, that's really for running SharePoint in a production environment where they recommend running multi-tiered application, at least it's a 3-tiered farm. Something that's interesting to note in comparing the system requirements for SharePoint 2016 and those for SharePoint 2013 is they really haven't changed that much. In SharePoint 2013, we required 64-bit servers with a minimum of 4 cores, and that's the case here as well with 2016. When it comes to the hard disk space, again, this hasn't changed very much from SharePoint 2016. We've got 8 gigabyte system drives. That said, the amount of disk space needed on those servers will very much depend on the amount of content that you're planning to store and some of the services you might be expecting to run. RAM has changed a little bit. In some of these cases, the RAM requirements have gone up slightly. So, for example, for the final item in the table here where we talk about running SharePoint 2016 in a production farm, a pilot, or a UAT farm, in SharePoint 2013 required a minimum of 12 gigabytes of RAM, and for 2016 it's saying 12 to 16 gigabytes of RAM. One interesting requirement here, the second row on the table that really specifies a development environment, sorry, not the second, the third item is what I mean to point out. Sorry, I'll go back to the second item. In SharePoint 2016 for a SharePoint development environment, sorry, in 2013 for a development environment, we were always recommended to have 24 gigs of RAM in a development environment, and now Microsoft is saying between 16 and 24 gigs. So the RAM requirements either haven't changed very much or they've gone up just a little bit. In the case of a development environment, they've potentially gone down depending on what your need is specifically. In terms of operating system required, you are looking at a minimum of Windows Server 2012 R2, 64-bit of course, and you can use either the standard or data center edition. The release candidate will also run on Windows Server 2016 Tech Preview 4. Here's where there's one change that occurred from Beta 2. The Beta 2 that came out, you could run on Tech Preview 3, but the release candidate does require Tech Preview 4. And then the database minimum system requirement now is Microsoft SQL Server 2014 with Service Pack 1 and 64-bit, of course. And the .NET Framework you require is a minimum of 4.5.2. Doug, is there anything you would add to this on the system requirements?
No, I don't think so. I think that covers it. Note that it is still evolving a little bit. Some of the system requirements for like Power Pivot and Power View require later versions of SQL Server that haven't been fully released yet. So, while these system requirements cover the basics of SharePoint, for some of the features like Power Pivot and Power View, there are some additional SQL requirements that are not even available yet. So.
Okay, great. All right, why don't we jump into the demo?
Great, thanks. And I wanted to build a little bit off of what Antonio was talking about with Microsoft and how they are basically taking what they've applied in or learned from using SharePoint in Office 365 and applying that to SharePoint 2016 on-premises. Like Antonio said, what they've done is they've learned a lot by running this themselves at a very large scale, and as a result, they've incorporated some of those changes to make things simpler for us who run SharePoint on-premises or have been for quite some time now. And as Antonio said, one of the things that they're changing is they've made patching a lot simpler. We're not going to go into a lot of the patching stuff. Basically what it means is that you can do patching without any downtime, which is a great enhancement. We're not going to demo that, obviously, but one of the other things that they've done is they've introduced this concept of what's called a min role, and that is the idea that each server in the farm has a very specific role of what that server does. And right now, what you're looking at is central administration for a SharePoint 2016 farm. Notice how it doesn't look that much different than SharePoint 2013. However, there is, on this screen, there is a convert server role in this farm option. And right now, this farm is a single server farm, which means that it has every service that the farm needs is running on one server. However, if I wanted to, I could convert this server to a different role as either an application, a front end, a distributed cache, or a search role. Note that these roles are mutually exclusive, and it actually changes what binaries are installed on the server. So a search server, for example, can never have what the same services running on it as a front-end server or a distributed cache or an application server. And what this does is this allows Microsoft, when they're running SharePoint at scale in the cloud, to very finely tune the performance of the servers so that they're doing exactly what they need to do without impacting each other or the performance of each other, when they're running at a large scale in the cloud. One of the things that I just personally feel about this, though, is that while this is a nice thing if you're running Office 365, it can lead to sort of a proliferation of servers for clients or companies that may not need all these different role segregations. So notice how there is an option for a custom role. A custom role is basically, I opt out of the min role feature capability, and I'm just going to define my own role. So it's basically the old way of doing things. So you can set up whatever services you want. The binaries necessary for running those services are applied to all of the servers, so there's no real segregation in that regard. So my suspicion is that most companies will not have, for example, separate front-end and distributed cache servers. Instead, they'll probably set up a custom min role and use that instead. But it does have some nice features if you are going to use it. One of the things that it does is it shows you when your servers are in compliance or out of compliance for these roles and can help you set them back and keep them in line. So for example, if I click on Manage Servers in this farm, you'll notice that there's a new column here that says whether it's compliant with the role of single server farm, and right now it says yes. And then if I were to click on the server right here, it would show me all the services that are running on this server right now and whether those services are compliant with the server's role as a single server farm. But again, if you set this up using the min role strategy, you would have separate servers for distributed cache, search, web front end, and then application servers.
Those are great points, Doug.
You'd like to add to that?
Yeah, those are great points, Doug. The single server option is interesting. So single server replaces the standalone installation option from SharePoint 2013 and 2010. One interesting difference, again, between 2013 and 2010 is that, 2013 and 2016 is if you do choose the single server option, which again replaces standalone install, it will not install SQL Express for you. You will need to have your own separate SQL Server, full SQL Server installation installed before you install SharePoint 2016. So if you choose that single server option, you've got to install SQL Server yourself beforehand. There is no more SQL Express included with the SharePoint install.
Yeah. So just to highlight that point.
Oh, yeah.
Just to highlight that point, I've got the single server farm right here on the server called SP01, and then I've got SQL Server installed on a separate external server called SQL01.
Yep. An interesting point about the screen that Doug showed to convert the server role is that when we work with clients that installed SharePoint as a new environment, had it running for a while, and it kind of took off. Really, people took to it in the company and really started using it in a big way. They often started with a single server farm, and they just kept using that going forward because in the past, replacing that with a multi-server farm was a fairly big task. In this case, this actually would allow clients to start with a single server farm, And once they do see uptake in the SharePoint, usage of SharePoint internally, they can then convert that to a multi-server farm by, starting with their single server farm, changing that to one of these other roles and changing custom, and then adding new servers to the farm and assigning them to the appropriate role. So it kind of, one opinion I have of this is a single server farm allows someone to start with a very small installation and then grow that to a farm as necessary, as usage increases, as they need new services within SharePoint. A couple of other points to add to the min role feature is that if you are looking to install a farm that is a multi-server farm that is fully min role compliant, then you will need to have a separate server for each one of these roles. So let's ignore custom and single server for a second. You'll have to have one server for your application server, another for your front end, another for your distributed cache, and another for your search, right? And of course, you'll need another for a database. So when it comes to a multi-server farm that's 100% min role compliant, you're going to need at least 5 servers. And that, of course, doesn't include any kind of high availability. If you want things to be highly available, then the number of servers actually increases really rapidly. You start to look at having actually 11 servers in a farm if you want a 100% min role compliant, highly available farm. And the reason it's 11 and not 10 is distributed cache in a high availability environment actually requires 3 servers for a quorum. And of course, this doesn't include the Office Online servers, which is what the Office Web App Service have been renamed to. Again, if you want the Office Online server to also be included, so Office Web Apps, you're going to need another server for that. And if you're in a highly available environment, you're actually going to need 2 new servers for that. So you very quickly get up to 13 servers or more, depending on your need for high availability. So, to Doug's point about people probably using the custom role here, unless you have the ability to deploy a large farm from the get-go, we do expect the custom role to be used pretty heavily. And all that said, you can have a mix of roles. You can have some servers that follow these specific roles, like maybe you have a front end and an application server, and then others that follow the custom role. So you can mix and match that way too.
Thanks, Antonio. And one last note I'll make about this before we move on is that there are health check rules in place for this, health analyzer rules in place to check this as well. So if you've got a server that's set up as a min role web front end, for example, and it's out of compliance, there will be a health check rule that'll pop up and warn you about this, warn you about that. So it's kind of baked into everything going forward. All right, another interesting feature that I actually really like quite a bit is something called fast site creation. What fast site creation does is it gives you the ability to very quickly create a site collection based off of a template. And I'm going to demo this here and walk you through how this actually works. It's done through PowerShell, so excuse me if I get a little bit technical here, but I'm going to make this, I'm going to copy this one by one. So basically the first step in doing this, what this does is this allows you to create a template. So we're going to create a template for a team site. What we're going to do, the team site template is called STS#0, and we're going to use the PowerShell command to enable this template to be used for a master site collection. And I'm going to go ahead and run that. And then once I tell SharePoint that it can use the team site template to create a master site collection, I'm going to go ahead and create that master site collection by first getting the content database that's attached to my site collection. And then I'm just going to say new SP site master. This is a new PowerShell command, SharePoint 2016, that allows you to create a new master site template that can be used to very quickly create future site collections. So what I've just done here is I've created a new site collection, and we can actually go ahead and look at this, that can be used for very quickly creating very quickly creating future site collections. So you can see here, there's now a new site collection called Site Master, and then it's got a GUID after it. And the way this works is, instead of actually creating a site collection from scratch and provisioning all the features and doing all the stuff that it used to do under the old versions of SharePoint, what it's actually doing is just doing a straight database copy of the existing site master, which is basically a blank site collection that it uses as a template. So then I can go back to my PowerShell and go ahead and create a site collection based off of, let me just change this to 2 here. I've already got number 1. Go back to my PowerShell and very quickly create a site collection that's based off of that site master. And notice that under the PowerShell command, there's new ST site, and then there's a dash create from site master using this template. And it'll go ahead and create that site collection. And when I hit the enter key, it actually tells me how it's copying the database, copying the information through the database. And this takes, a few seconds, and then it's done. And then we have our site collection. So I think that's actually a pretty nice feature. I like that one because it allows you to, if you have a bunch of site collections to create, here's our new site collection. It's a much quicker process than the way it used to be. Another thing in SharePoint 2013, and I don't really have a good demo for this, but I do want to talk through it briefly, is some of the hybrid feature capabilities that are built into SharePoint Server 2016. One of the things is that there are some site features now that you can, for example, follow SharePoint Server and SharePoint Online sites and see them in a consolidated list. So it's basically when you have a team site that's on SharePoint Online and a team site that's on SharePoint On-Prem, the users can follow them and see them all together. So there's sort of like this combined experience for them. There's also combined features for OneDrive for Business. Users can sync files with Office 365 and share them with others, and then you can also access your files directly through Office 365 from any device. And lastly, hybrid search provides a sort of a new solution alternative. It allows you to search from either on-prem or in the cloud and see a combined result set of the results from your on-prem installation or from the cloud installation. And you'll note that the index, when you have a hybrid search experience, the index still sits in Office 365 on the cloud, but that index can be accessed from either on-prem or in the cloud. And one thing, this is just another example as I'm showing you here. If I select a new search service application, it's going to ask me, is this a cloud search service application? Another thing that I wanted to point out is Microsoft is working very hard at eliminating a lot of the file size restrictions, basically all the size limitations that used to exist under older versions of SharePoint. One example of that is the file size restriction. If you look at in central administration under the web application, there used to be a setting here that said, and I'm just scrolling down there now, the maximum upload size of a single file was basically 2 gigabytes. And right now, when I just installed it, it defaulted to that. And that was a hard limit in SharePoint. You couldn't make that any bigger than that. It wouldn't let you, and it just wouldn't work. However, in SharePoint 2016, you can make this much bigger. I'm going to make it approximately 8 gigabytes, and it works just fine. So as long as you have the hardware in place to support uploading those kinds of files, you can now increase your file upload size limit by quite a bit. And I don't know if now, Antonio, would be a good time to go through the list view stuff as well?
Sure. Yeah, we can definitely take a look at that. Don't mind navigating there?
Yeah.
There's been a lot of talk about the list view threshold. That's a threshold within SharePoint that many of us have had to deal with and, of course, had difficulties dealing with as well. So in the past, the list view threshold controls the number of items that can be returned by SharePoint in any particular view. And this actually relates to the number of round trips to the database to retrieve those items. And the default for this value was always 5,000, and we were always told to, as much as possible, try not to increase it beyond 5,000. And that really hasn't changed in 2016. That threshold is still there. It's still set at 5,000 by default. But one area that has improved that relates to it is the management of indexes. So you could always get around this limit and show, certain more items in a view or certain types of items in a view by indexing your columns in a particular list or library. And what SharePoint 2016 introduces is automatic management of those indexes on lists and libraries. And the way you do that, as Doug is showing, is for each list and library, there is now within advanced settings. So if you go to list settings and then advanced, there's this item here at the bottom that we see called automatic index management. And that's on by default. And what SharePoint does with that is there's a new timer job in SharePoint called the large list column index management timer job. And it runs automatically on a regular basis, and you can actually see that in Central Admin. And what it'll do is it'll examine any list it finds that has more than 2,500 items. And when it sees that on a list, it will then automatically create index columns. And the index columns that it creates, so the column that it chooses to make an index column, is a complex decision that it looks at the filters on views and the views that you've defined on the list in order to determine which columns get indexed. And you don't really have any control over that. The only control you really have here is turning this on for lists and libraries, and then of course the timer job that runs as well. So that's how that works. So they've introduced some automated functionality that allows us to automatically get around this list view threshold limit, which is still there, and it's still there for good reason. Whenever SharePoint shows items in a list, it needs to, of course, retrieve those items from a database and security trim those, and you need to be able to do that in a very efficient way. And that's what the list view threshold is there for. Yeah, and right there, that's the value there within Central Admin. That's set on a per web application basis, and again, that's set at 5,000 by default. We're often told to shy away from increasing that, but I've worked in many environments where this is increased, slightly, 10,000, even 20, 25,000, and the environment operates very well. It does depend very much on the servers that are configured for in the environment. I wouldn't increase this on a single server farm, for example. But on larger farms, you can safely increase this within certain margins. But all that said, with the new automatic management of indexes, you really don't need to increase this anymore.
Okay, great. And then, I don't know, Antonio, if you want to talk about the Compliance Center too?
Sure. So let's leave the screen here where you have it, Doug, and let's talk about that a little bit for now. So one of my personal favorites in terms of new features in SharePoint 2016 is the new Compliance Center. So Office 365 has had a Compliance Center for some time. And this Compliance Center has now made its way into the on-prem version, which I think is a great addition. So it is dependent on your search infrastructure, so you have to first create a search service application. Search has to be configured, and all of the DLP policies are very much dependent on the search index. So you've got to make sure your search application is configured and your search crawls are running before you go to configure any DLP policies. Once you've got search in place, then you can create a new site collection called a Compliance Center site collection. That's a new site collection template, and Doug has already done that here. And then once you create that, you get the site collection that you see here. And I believe you can only have one Compliance Center site collection in your farm. Once that's in place, you have two different kinds of policies you can configure. The first is deletion policies, and the second is data loss prevention policies. Now the deletion policies are pretty simple, and if you've worked with the information management policies and assigning those to content types in SharePoint, these are similar to that, but these are actually simpler. The information management policies and the retention that you can assign there, that gives you a lot more flexibility, and you can assign those to content types. You can't do that here with deletion policies. Deletion policies are pretty simple. You can create retention periods, and you can assign certain amounts of time after which the retention expires. But the only options you really have for the action that's taken on a deletion policy is either to have your document deleted to the recycle bin or have it permanently deleted. There is no option for a deletion policy to execute a workflow like you can with the information management policy. So information management policies are still there. They can still be assigned to content types. You should still use them if you want some complex retention actions to occur, and we do still use them. But the nice thing about the deletion policies here is you can apply them both to SharePoint content and to OneDrive for Business content as well. So if you want to have a deletion policy where, after content has been there and has not been modified for 5 years, it should be automatically deleted or automatically deleted to the recycle bin. If you've got those simple kinds of policies, this is where you would configure those. Now, when you create a policy, you would create a new policy here. Can I ask you to click New, Doug? New item. Yeah. Okay, and you're going to give it a name. You're going to give it a description. We don't have to necessarily go through all of this. Okay, and then you're going to assign one or more rules to the policy. Now you see you've got the set of rules there. You click New on the rule, and here's where you specify your deletion rules. So you give it a name, and here's those 2 actions I mentioned. You can delete to the recycle bin, or you can permanently delete. You can choose the retention to be based on either last modified date, and if you drop that down, Doug, or the creation date. So you've got those 2 simple choices. And then you choose the time period. And the time period can be specified in years if you want 2 years. Or if you drop down that second drop down, Doug, let's see what else is available. You can do it in months or days. So those, pretty simple deletion policies. Effective if you want to have these simple sorts of policies applied both consistently in OneDrive and in SharePoint. You would save that, and you have multiple rules and so on a particular policy. Okay? So let's switch out of that and go to DLP policy. So if we click on DLP management there on the side, here's where you would create a new DLP policy. Now, several years ago, I think this goes back a good 5 or 6 years now. I'm not sure of the exact time frame, but Microsoft acquired rights to the RSA DLP engine from EMC. And that's what they integrated into what originally started out as force protection in Office 365, and then the Office 365 DLP engine within the Compliance Center. And that's what you have here as well. So the RSA DLP engine is a very well-known, popular DLP engine that's integrated into many systems. If you've ever had a Cisco Iron Port firewall, it also used the RSA DLP engine. And you've got all the power of that DLP engine here to look for regular expressions or keywords or sensitive content in your documents and list items. And again, this is all based on your search index. So you've got to make sure you've got search running first before you go creating DLP policies. Now you have a number of templates there that you can see, and those templates each have a number of policies built in. So the one Doug has selected here is U.S. State Social Security number. And the laws around that. You can look at U.S. state breach notification laws, DPA, the Data Protection Act, and so on. You can look at UK financial data, and there's a number of other templates that you can get as well for this. In Office 365, you've actually got 51 different templates available for different international identification numbers. You can have all those running here. So if we choose the U.S. state Social Security number for a second, there we go. Now that's going to check your content for regular expressions containing Social Security numbers. The next option that's available there, where it says the number 9, you can actually choose the number of instances of Social Security numbers before a warning or a policy is enforced. So for some organizations, having one Social Security number is a bad thing, and you want to stop that getting into your content. But for others, and this sometimes applies to credit card numbers, sometimes employees have to deal with a credit card number. But if they happen to have a document or something that has 10 credit card numbers, then they want to be concerned about that. And that's where you configure that. You can have a policy apply only if, as it says there, 5 credit card numbers appear. When content is detected that conforms to this policy, you can have an incident report automatically emailed to particular users. So where Doug has selected there, you can enter an email address, and that's often your InfoSec team or your compliance officer, for example. And the next option available there, if you check on that notify checkbox, you can have policy tips displayed to the end user. So policy tips are really useful. They're a really useful feature that's been in Outlook, for example, for some time, since 2013 on the desktop, where you can have policy tips shown to end users if an email contains a credit card number, for example. Well, that same feature now makes its way to SharePoint. And that final checkbox there that we've got, block access to the content, essentially if content is detected as having a policy, one of these policies enforced on it or conforming to one of these policies, you can block access to this content. And when you do that, when you do block access to the content, there's only certain people that will be able to have access to it at that point. SharePoint will actually change the icon on a document so that it has a little red circle on the document highlighting that a DLP policy has applied to it. And when you click on the ellipsis to that document and you get a the window appearing that normally appears where you have edit, share, and follow, and so on, there's a link there to see the policy tip, and at that point it'll tell you that access has been blocked to that item. When access is blocked to an item, the only people that can then access the item are the site collection administrator, the site owner, the document owner, and I believe also the last user that modified the document can also access the document, but it won't be available to any other users. These policies are enforced both after these policies have been configured. So for example, SharePoint will do scans of your content and highlight content that's already in SharePoint and show you which ones conform to the policies or which ones are having policies enforced on them, or let's say violate policies. And also when users upload content, you can also have at that point a warning showed to the user or a policy tip or have access blocked to the content. And the policies here all apply both to SharePoint and OneDrive for Business as well. Doug, is there anything you would add to that?
No. There was a question about which versions of SharePoint include the data loss prevention. I believe it's just Enterprise, isn't it? I don't know the answer to that. I don't know if you do, Antonio.
In terms of the license, so it's only 2016, of course, a new feature to 2016. I believe it's only the Enterprise edition. I can double check on that.
That's what I was saying too. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
There's
it's
one
in the
other
Enterprise
thing
edition tab here, so.
Yeah. If you go back to the data loss prevention policy screen for just a second, there's one thing I forgot to mention. So if we just save this policy here, Doug. Oh, you need to include an email address there. Okay, once you've got a policy here, the next thing you have to do, that policy is not getting enforced yet. You then need to click on the left-hand side there, that link for DLP policy assignments for site collections. And then here you would create a new item, and here's where you'd actually assign a policy to a site collection. So first you choose your site collection, as it says there. So let's look for a site collection. So you can have, a small set of policies and have them apply to one or more site collections. You don't need to create a different set of policies per site collection. You also cannot get any more specific than the site collection level. Yes, we just choose home here. And then you'd manage assigned policies, and you would actually choose the policy that you want to have applied. And then you'd save that. And now that policy is getting applied to the site collection. And the last thing I'll mention on the DLP capabilities is in SharePoint 2013, we had the eDiscovery Center introduced. That's also another site collection you can create specifically for legal discovery. In SharePoint 2016, they've improved the eDiscovery Center. There it is there, the eDiscovery Center. They've improved it in that from the eDiscovery Center, you can run DLP queries, and it'll use the same DLP engine that you just saw here within the Compliance Center. So as part of your e-discovery activities, if your legal team needs to find sensitive content or social security numbers, they can actually run those queries from the e-discovery center and then output reports, export reports of what those DLP queries find. So the same DLP engine is integrated both into the Compliance Center and into the e-discovery center, which is another great addition from a security perspective.
Great. Sounds good. Is there anything else that you want to cover, Antonio, before we head into questions?
There was a little bit on the ribbon. If we went back to the the view here, if you go to Documents. So we talked a little bit at the beginning how some of the user experience in Office 365 we're now seeing appear in SharePoint 2016. And these are just a few minor additions here. One is right there where Doug is pointing. We've got this new ribbon that appears, which comes to us directly from Office 365. So these are some of the high usage items that users will typically use, like creating a new document or uploading a document, syncing for OneDrive, for example, sharing content. So instead of having to use the ribbon, the traditional ribbon in SharePoint, we can now access some commonly used items right here, which makes it a little bit faster to work with content. You know, this is a small addition, but I think a really good new efficient way for users to work. The traditional ribbon in SharePoint has gotten a little bit heavy and busy and can sometimes be difficult to find specific actions. So this makes it a little faster to get at commonly used functions. The other thing that we don't see here, which is interesting, is the app launcher. So if you know the app launcher from Office 365, it's a little waffle icon that appears in the top left-hand side that lets you access apps within Office 365. Well, that's now available in SharePoint 2016. And it's kind of good that it's not showing here because it lets us make the point that for the app launcher to appear, you have to configure the user profile service. So once that application is configured within Central Admin, once you have user profile sync running, then the app launcher will appear here. And the app launcher gives you right now some access to some simple functions in SharePoint 2016. It will give you access by default to your newsfeed, to OneDrive, and to your list of sites. And it will be, I understand, configurable going forward. It's something that will be extensible. And then the last UI improvement in SharePoint 2016, which again we're not going to demo here, is the mobile pages. So a lot of these pages that you're seeing here have been rebuilt to be mobile friendly and touch friendly right out of the box. So SharePoint 2016 very much built for being accessed through a tablet or a phone and to be responsive, fully responsive right out of the gate. Doug, is there anything else you wanted to add?
No, I don't think so. I think we can move on to questions now. I don't know,
Sure.
Julia, if you had any specifically, or if we should just handle the ones that have come in so far. Or...
Yeah, I have a couple. So let's start off with the first one about an upgrade. My organization is on SharePoint 2010. If we upgrade, can we go straight to 2016?
Yeah, so Microsoft actually considered that as a possible feature or that they would like to be able to build into SharePoint 2016, which is an upgrade path directly from SharePoint 2010, but they never actually did it. So you still, just like going from 2007 to 2013, and you had to lay over at 2010, you still have to upgrade to 2013 before you upgrade to SharePoint 2016, unless you're using some kind of tool that sort of automates that process for you.
Okay, great. And then someone wanted to know a little bit more on InfoPath. Are they still going to work in SharePoint 2016?
Yeah, and I don't know if you want to do that one, Antonio?
Sure, I can take that one. So InfoPath 2013 is definitely supported in SharePoint 2016, and it will continue to be supported until 2026, so for another 10 years. There is no identified replacement for InfoPath yet at this time, although I do think we find the new concept of Power Apps in SharePoint to be something very promising to replace InfoPath. Doug, any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I agree. Same.
Okay, and what about SharePoint Designer? Is it supported in SharePoint 2016?
Yeah, it's pretty much the same story as InfoPath. SharePoint Designer will work in 2016.
Yeah, there won't be any new version of SharePoint Designer. It's still SharePoint Designer 2013 that you have to use with SharePoint 2016. And again, that's going to be supported until 2026, so for another 10 years.
Okay, great. Someone is asking, our organization is looking for full Excel features compared to desktop to Office web apps. Does 2016 give that experience?
No, actually in 2016, Excel Services was kind of ripped out of 2016, so it's not even available in 2016. You get the traditional Office web apps experience in 2016, but if you want full Excel features, you're going to have to either have desktop or Office 365.
Okay, great. So we have a couple questions about how responsive SharePoint 2016 will be. Do you all know anything more about that and the mobile capabilities?
Yeah, so ironic, it's kind of ironic, but SharePoint 2016 is not a responsive site. It's better for a mobile experience than much better than previous versions of SharePoint, but it's not totally responsive. But that being said, Microsoft just released a responsive design package for SharePoint 2013 and 2016 that you can use to make it responsive. So although it's not baked into the product, they have released a responsive design package that you can use right off of GitHub.
Okay, great. Sorry, these are coming in kind of fast, so I'm trying to prioritize them so we have enough time here. Someone wants to know if SharePoint 2016 will allow nested SharePoint security groups.
I can take that one. No, it does not. So the management of security groups is the same in 2016 as it was in 2013 as it was in 2010.
Okay, great. And what is the latest ETA for the full release of 2016?
We are still being told. Go ahead.
No, you go ahead.
I mean, we are still being told second quarter 2016. So.
Yeah. We suspect May or June right now.
Okay, great. The next question is, I have a few custom farm-based solutions built in SharePoint 2010 and 2013. How much support is there for that in 2016?
Farm-based solutions will still work just as they did in previous versions of SharePoint. Note that as with any upgrade of custom code, you may need to modify for deprecated methods and things like that. But note that the upgrade is not as significant from 2013 to 2016 as it was from 2010 to 2013 when it comes to custom code and full trust farm solutions.
Okay,
Julia,
great.
there is one question I see in the list I'd like to address, if that's all right.
Okay, go ahead.
Is the DLP policy available for SharePoint Foundation or for the paying version of SharePoint? I think we partly addressed that already in the DLP. The Compliance Center and the DLP features are available with the enterprise license. But what I wanted to also mention was there is no more SharePoint Foundation version. So that's one interesting change of SharePoint 2016. They're no longer releasing a version of SharePoint Foundation, so a free version of SharePoint. It'll only be standard and enterprise licenses.
Okay, great. I think we have a follow-up question for the designer and the InfoPath questions. Does this mean that Power Apps is actually going to replace designer and InfoPath for workflows and forms?
Replace it, replacing it implies full parity with features and capabilities, and I don't think we'll see that with Power Apps. I would call it more of an evolution, if you can say it that way.
Yeah, I think
Power Apps.
That's a good way.
Power Apps will it's sort of evolving into the new way of doing things in that space, and you'll see people use the SharePoint Designer less and less, but it's not a full parity in terms of capabilities.
Yeah, I would agree.
Okay, great. Okay, let's see. Are the next-gen portals going to replace site collections?
That's an interesting question.
That's a good
I think
question.
That's almost a philosophical one. I don't think so. I think next-gen portals give us a great new experience when working with SharePoint sites and portals. But the concept of a site collection, I personally think, will still remain, right? It encapsulates a set of sites, and with many clients, this doesn't happen all the time, but a site collection can represent a department in a company or a business unit, and then different teams within that perhaps end up with their own site. So there's more to a site collection than just the user experience, the portal experience, for example. Doug, what would you add to that?
Yeah, I agree. I mean, next-gen portals are more like pre-built, great feature, fully functioning, capable site collections that serve a specific purpose. But they're still site collections. It's just a type of site collection.
Yeah.
Okay, great. Okay, if Power Apps is an evolution, does it mean that we will have a free tier because now it requires a subscription?
No, I don't think there'll be a free tier in Office 365, but you never know. I don't know. I'm not Microsoft.
Yeah, I would doubt that as well. I doubt there'll be a free tier. With SharePoint 2016 Server, they've removed the foundation version, so there's no more free version of SharePoint. So I guess that's not going to suddenly happen in Office 365 as well.
Okay, great. Are there any changes on SSRS and SharePoint integration in SharePoint 2016?
Very little, actually. Just in general, Microsoft is really pushing the cloud model for business intelligence for SSRS and SSAS and stuff like that. It doesn't mean that on-premise stuff is going away anytime soon. It's just that they're not making as big of investments in the on-premise versions of those products like SSRS and SSAS. So the business intelligence capabilities that you could expect them to invest in are things like Power BI in Office 365 and Azure. So SSR, to answer your question, SSRS, as far as I know, has very little to no changes going into SharePoint 2016, and Power View will stay pretty much the same.
Okay, great. There was a change to People Picker from 2010 to 2013. Is there going to be a change in 2016?
I believe the People Picker works exactly the same in 2016 as it does in 2013. I haven't seen any changes to it at all.
Okay, great. Oh, okay. Are you going to show something?
If I can get the site settings. I was just gonna show the People Picker. So it looks exactly the same.
Yeah, it behaves very similarly. It is claims aware in 2016 the way it was in 2013.
And you have the notification option. So it's almost exactly the same.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay. Great, and we are at the end of the presentation today. We had tons of questions, lots of feedback. Thank you all for attending today. Thanks Antonio and Doug for presenting. It was a great presentation. The recording of today's presentation will be on our YouTube channel, so we will be sending out that link if you guys are interested in rewatching today's presentation. Thank you all again for attending today, and thanks Antonio and Doug.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.
Have a great day.